Welcome, I'm Glenn Fay, Director of Education here at the Centre for Independent Studies. In any school system, nothing's more fundamental than students being able to read. It takes reading proficiency for learning in any subject to fully develop. But at the same time, reading deficits will hold back learning and can ultimately leave students disengaged with school altogether. Simply put, struggling readers will be struggling learners. Yet across many countries, especially English-speaking ones, reading results have been lagging for decades. 4 in 10 Australian 15-year-olds don't meet the national proficient standard in reading. And our NAPLAN results show the vast majority of students who fall behind national minimum standards early in schooling will never go on to exceed the benchmark later on in their schooling. It doesn't have to be this way. With evidence-based and effective teaching, students of all abilities and backgrounds can be proficient readers. But as CIS has long documented, there are too many examples of approaches to reading that don't follow the educational science. Today's guest has dedicated years of her research and advocacy to unpack why teaching kids to read has gone so wrong. The upshot of her work? A lot of schools aren't effectively teaching children how to read, resulting in children harmed, money wasted, and teachers lacking the resources they need. To tell us more about her groundbreaking work on reading, I'm pleased to welcome to the CIS, Emily Hanford. Emily is Senior Producer and Correspondent at American Public Media. Among several other seminal works, she's the host and lead producer of the recent podcast, Sold a Story: How Teaching Kids to Read Went So Wrong. Emily, a warm welcome to CIS, and thanks for being able to join us.
Thank you. Good morning.
Emily, you've been a journalist for some years. What is it that drew you to work so heavily in education?
Well, I've been an education reporter. I think I just had my 15th anniversary. And I was interested, I was hired to cover education and education research in particular. And I did long form radio documentaries, sort of before we even had podcasts. And I was interested always in a couple of big questions. And one was sort of about education as a force or not for opportunity and equity. Like, how do schools promote equality and equity in societies? And I was also really interested in how people learn and the results from cognitive science and sort of whether those are being applied or not in classrooms. And a lot of the work that I was doing was focused on older people, older children, preparation for post-secondary education, post-secondary college education in the United States, adult learners. And several years ago, I was interviewing students at community colleges, so 2-year colleges here in the United States that provide a huge amount of opportunity for lots of people to pursue higher education. And I was interviewing a bunch of students who were getting stuck in these remedial classes. And I met a whole bunch of students who really couldn't read. And I met one student in particular who told me about her challenges with reading and with dyslexia, which she diagnosed about herself. Many years, didn't get support, didn't get identified with that, didn't get good support for it. So essentially what happened is I just started asking this question: how did this woman end up in college, barely able to read, with what she thinks is a learning disability that was never identified, she never got help for? So it just wound me back. I started looking at dyslexia, which I knew nothing about, looking at dyslexia, understanding that there are all kinds of kids in the United States who really have a hard time learning to read, and they're not getting the help they need in school. I learned from a lot of their parents who had really become advocates for their children and had taken upon themselves to really learn about the brain, the reading brain, and like what was up for their kids, for me to learn about this gigantic body of research about reading and how we all learn to do it, whether we have a reading disability or not. Just what is reading in our brain? How does our brain do it? How do we get good at it? Why are some of us really good at it and some of us not? What is up with that? And it just led me to, it was like just peeling back the layers of the onion. It was like every story I did, I was like, oh, there's another story, there's another story, there's another story. And the core of the story is, yes, there's lots of people with reading disabilities who are harmed most when schools are not teaching kids how to read. But lots of kids are not being taught how to read. And if you know anything about dyslexia, you know it's a big spectrum. Some of us learn to read very easily. Some of us have a very hard time, and most of us are somewhere in between. And a whole lot of the kids who are in the in-between are being harmed because they're not being taught how to read well in ways that line up with what we know about what the brain needs to learn to become a good reader. That's not happening here in the United States. And it turns out in many other parts of the world when they first get to school, when they're 5, 6, 7 years old, that is the primary thing that children need to learn how to do to be successful and happy, I would say, with a lot of the rest of their educational career. And many kids are not getting what they need right there at the very beginning, and things are going off the rails for a lot of them.
So you've obviously started with regular reporting and into that podcast world, pretty much an early adopter as far as those things go. But what brought you to the stage where Sold a Story became your key work, and are you surprised by how popular that's taken off?
Interesting question. So like I said, I surprised myself a few years ago by staying on this reading thing. Usually I would work on these long projects, 2 or 3 of them a year, and I would go from topic to topic. So I got on this reading thing in about 2017, 2018, and I just kept going. And the questions in Sold a Story were the questions that started to be there from the very beginning. And they were really, how did this happen? How did it happen that there's a huge amount known about how people learn to read and what children need to be taught to learn how to do it? Why is all of this known? And it had been known for a very long time, decades. And yet so many teachers that I was meeting didn't know anything about it. So many people within schools had no idea that there was this big body of research. So it was really, how did that happen? And I would say what it boiled down to, what I understood through years of reporting, is that a lot of it came down to this one idea about reading and how it works that you can find in a lot of instructional materials and professional development in the United States and in other parts of the world too. And it's just this idea that little kids don't need to be taught how to sound out the words, because to be a good reader, you don't have to do that. There are other things that you can do to figure out what the words are. So little kids are being taught that when they're learning how to read and they come to a word they don't know, which is going to happen all the time when you're 5 and 6 years old, that they have all these different strategies they can use to figure out the word. And these things make a lot of sense. Think about something that makes sense. Look at one letter, look at a couple of the letters, the first sound, the last sound, look at the picture, think of the context of the story, and figure out the word that way. And it turns out that is missing what this really key component, which is that all of us, to become a good reader, you have to know how to sound out the words. It doesn't mean that once you are a good reader, you are sounding out every single word that you get to. In fact, you're not. There are different ways that your brain starts to know what those words are. But when we're good readers, we know tens of thousands of written words instantly on sight. And we got good at that because at some point we sounded the words out laboriously and painfully, like nails on a chalkboard. And we connected, this is really important, we connected the letters in the word with the pronunciation of the word and the meaning of the word. All of those things need to get kind of like glued together. And when those 3 things get glued together about a word, the pronunciation, the spelling, and the meaning, boom. If you are a typically developing reader, if you do not have a reading disability, a severe reading disability, those things get locked together and sort of get stored in your brain. And scientists probably wouldn't like the way that I'm talking about it, but it's like they're now there in your brain. And the only thing that can take them away is if you have like a horrible head injury or infection or something that, harms parts of your brain. Otherwise, they're there for you always. But lots of kids are not getting what they need to make those connections in the earliest stages of reading, and reading is becoming very hard and slow for them, and they don't like it and they turn away from it. And it's this whole exponential thing happens if they don't get off to a good start with reading. And the kids who get off to a good start get better and better and better. And the kids who don't sort of inch along and get like a little bit better, maybe. And then you have these huge gaps. And these are the gaps that you see in Australia, that we see in the United States, that we can see all over the world, where some kids are achieving way up here in reading and in school overall, and some kids are down here, and these gaps just keep getting wider and wider because the rich get richer, and these kids down here struggling just kind of are inching along and never becoming good readers.
So what is it about that, particularly in early reading, that makes, we talk often about the simple view of reading and what that means for understanding, particularly reading comprehension. What is it that goes wrong in interpreting that simple view, in your view, from what you've unpacked in your research?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is misunderstood because it does not say that reading is simple. It is a simple way of understanding an incredibly complex process, fascinating and complex process. Reading is very complicated. But the simple view of reading is really helpful because it like disentangles stuff about reading that's been really contentious for a really long time. And I think that reading has been contentious for a really long time because a lot of people with good intentions, right? People with good intentions understood that the goal of reading is to comprehend what you're reading, right? Everyone agrees on that. There really is no disagreement. That is the point. The question has always been, how does a little kid get there? How do you become someone who can comprehend what you read? And that's what we've been arguing about for centuries. And we argued about it for some really good reasons because no one really knew the answer. We didn't know how the brain comprehends text. But then over the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years, there's been all kinds of fascinating research done by different kinds of people: cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, linguists, psychologists, educators, all kinds of research. And it's really answered the question. And the simple view of reading equation is just a simple way to understand what reading is. So reading comprehension, which is the goal, is the product of two things. And these are two separate and yet interconnected things because they build on each other, right? So you can think of them as separate, but they're not entirely separate. So one is your ability to read the words themselves, to initially be able to decode them, to know how to sound them out, to be good at understanding something about the ways that letters and combinations of letters in the English language, because we're talking about English right now, the ways that it works, that you and I both, when we come across, all of us, when we come across a word we don't know, if we're good readers, the thing we attempt to do is sound that out and see if it's something that we know in spoken language. Often it isn't where we're reading, it isn't something, and then we have to look it up. And a lot of times, well, those embarrassing moments as an adult where we'll say something that we've read and we think we know the meaning of, and we'll say it and we will completely mispronounce it because we've only ever read it and we have no idea how it's pronounced, right? But so to get back to the simple view of reading, there are these two. So you've got to know how to read the words on the page, and you've got to know how to read those really quickly and accurately. And that is a hallmark of being a good reader. But you also have to have a big vocabulary and just know a lot of stuff and have good language comprehension. So knowing the meanings of lots of words, but also just understanding stuff about how language works and all that. And your reading comprehension ability is a product of those two things. And what's so fascinating when you disentangle that is reading comprehension, which we all want everyone to get to, is going to be nothing if you can't read the printed words, because zero, even if you know the meaning of tons of words, you're a very, very verbal person. You're a very, very verbal 5-year-old. And we know that we have some very, very precocious verbal 5-year-olds who go into school. And some of those kids will really struggle with reading. They're very smart children. They're very smart people. But this whole thing about understanding written text, their brain just isn't very good at that on its own. It really needs help. It really needs someone to show them how the system works. Some of us pick that up pretty easily, don't need a whole lot of help, right? So, but essentially your reading comprehension is a product of these two things. So your ability to read those written words and your language comprehension. So another reason that some kids struggle with reading is they could learn how to decode words like really, really well. But if they don't have a big vocabulary, if they don't have a lot of knowledge, their reading comprehension is never going to be that good. So, you know, the role of the school, the role of education, I would argue, really ultimately could be sort of boiled down to, are we doing a good job on both sides of the equation? Are we making sure at those very early stages that the decoding the words is not going to trip kids up? They know how to do it. They've got a lot of like tools to sound out the words. And I would say all through everyone's education, all the way through to all of us on this phone call, are continuing to expand our language comprehension and our knowledge. So our reading comprehension continues to expand. But you can't be weak. If you're weak on either side of that, you've got a problem.
So in many cases, we'll look at, even when kids begin school, significant differences emerge between some children who have got a lot of difficulties, and it seems to be related to a lack of vocabulary. So we put people in a basket, perhaps, that's the poverty basket. But why is it that phonics in particular is potentially the lever to lift those students who might start school behind to catch up to others in terms of reading?
Well, we know that there's all kinds of inequalities with the background knowledge, experience, opportunities that kids have when they start school and all through schooling, right? And that a huge amount of what kids are getting on the language comprehension part of their equation is coming from time outside of school. It's coming from their families. We know this from lots of research, and we actually know it from common sense, and many of us know it from personal experience. But if part of the goal of schooling is to help a child who may not have access to a background that's rich with opportunities for going to museums, traveling around the world, having lots of books read to them, if we want to give that kid an opportunity to really gain knowledge too, the best thing we can do is teach them how to read the printed words, because then they have access to the entire world through every book that's ever been written, every novel, every nonfiction text, every scientific paper. You can essentially teach yourself anything if you know how to read. So I say this often, but I think the most important thing that any school or teacher can do if their interest is ultimately equity is teach all kids how to read the words when they're young. Their job is not done there, but the job starts there. And if you don't do a good job there, just the rest of what you're trying to do isn't going to bear as much fruit. All the work that you're doing, trying to help them gain knowledge and gain vocabulary, if they don't have those good skills at reading the written word, they're just not going to get as much out of all the opportunities that you present them along the way of their schooling. It is a fundamental equity lever at the beginning of a child's schooling.
One of the most striking comments that I took away out of Sold a Story was this observation that it felt like schools were teaching kids to sound like they could read, not necessarily that they were in fact learning to read. Why is that misconception exist?
I think it exists for a bunch of different reasons. So I think here in the United States, I'll speak for the United States because I know most about this. The teacher preparation system is not very good. We have lots of documented, and this is not good for anyone. This is not a criticism of teachers. It's that we don't do a good job preparing teachers. We don't prepare them the way we prepare lawyers and economics professors and doctors. So I think one of the things that happens is that teachers go into school without having good preparation for the job at hand, in particular, teaching kids to read. And they're faced with all these kids who need to learn to read, and they want to teach them to read. And so these kind of strategies that make it seem like they're reading are appealing. It's something for the teachers to do. And the kindergarten and first grade teachers may see that the kids look like they're reading. And in fact, what they're doing is memorizing a lot of the words, not really sounding them out and making that connection that I just talked about between the meaning, pronunciation, and the spelling. Our human brains, smart little children, can memorize hundreds, thousands of words, but you start to get to a few thousand words and the human brain can't do that anymore. It has to have another way to get all those things into their brain. So if you just look at kindergarten, first and second grade, the easy texts that we give kids in those years, because they should be getting easy texts, have a lot of the same words in them. A lot of kids can memorize them. They're being taught to look at the pictures if they come to a word they don't know. They're guessing a lot. They're being asked questions that are sort of based on them getting a gist of the story. And the teacher's often giving a lot of introduction to the story. And then the kids are reading it and other kids might be reading it with them. Lots of kids can pick up and look like they've got this book, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to get any book you give them, especially to get a book you give them when they're in third and fourth grade, when the pictures start to go away, the words get longer, there start to be words they've never seen before, maybe they've never heard before. this is when a lot of kids fall apart. And kids can be falling apart for a lot of different reasons. But I think it may be underappreciated that many kids are falling apart because their word level reading skills just aren't very strong.
Emily, you just were alluding to there what you call the 3 cueing method. This is something that maybe a lot of educators are not familiar with by name, but certainly in practice, the concept holds for a lot of early reading instruction. Can you explain for our audience what's the understanding that you've drawn from what the 3 cueing method is, and why has it not been very effective for teaching kids to read?
Well, I think you point out well that not everyone knows this is cueing or 3 cueing. Some people call it multi-cueing, searchlights. In the United States, it's called MSV, meaning, structure, visual, which are these different cues you can think about for the words, like think about what the meaning might be, think about what kind of word it could be, the syntax, the structure of the sentence, use the visual cues. What does the word look like? You know, there are sometimes lessons in the United States you can see where kids are being taught to memorize words by the shape of the letters, which really doesn't help you for very long because there are too many words that look exactly the same because there's only 26 letters, but we're making thousands of words with these 26 letters in the alphabet. So the cueing system, known by different names, many teachers know in practice, which is when a kid comes to a word they don't know, teach them lots of different strategies to figure out the word. And again, it sounds good and it makes sense. And this is a very subtle thing, which is why I had to spend 6 podcast episodes, I guess, trying to describe it in the history, which is context is very important to understanding the meaning of words, right? I mean, we all do that. We come forward where we don't know, we sound it out, we think of what could this be? It's just that you don't want to teach kids at the very beginning that that's a way for them to actually identify the word. You actually want them to just focus in on the word, sound it out, try it a few different ways because English spelling is such that we pronounce different letters and, you know, same combinations of letters in different ways, depending on the context, depending on what other letters are around them. English spelling is hard, but it's fascinating and it can be explained most of the time. Actually, it can pretty much always be explained if you bring in some history, like which is the history of our language. Why do we have that, you know, wacky spelling? And of course, it's difficult because a lot of the most common words have sort of the strangest spelling in the English language. But anyway, that's what the cueing system is. Many teachers know it. I've interviewed so many teachers at this point, and I will tell you that so many of them had a gut level feeling that something was wrong here. You know, they're like this, they always had kids who weren't getting it. They always had these sort of nagging questions like, is the kid really reading or did he just memorize the book? They would have the parents come and be like, I think she's just memorizing the book. And they would say, oh, don't worry, don't worry. But then they would leave the meeting with the parent thinking, is the kid just memorizing the book? So like all over this country, there's been sort of a nagging thing at a lot of teachers, like something maybe isn't quite right here. But they sort of looked up and everyone else was doing it, telling them to do it this one way. And it was working out for some kids. They always have, in some cases, many kids who are learning how to read, because many kids do learn how to read sort of in spite of the instruction. And sort of the higher percentage of kids you have from a family where they do have access to lots of like knowledge and lots being read to and are being taught at home. And I will tell you, one of the main takeaways of Sold a Story is that if your child is struggling with reading at 5 or 6 years old and you notice as a parent and you have the ability to do something about it, as in you have the time to teach the kid yourself or the money to hire someone else to do it, you're going to do it in an instant, which is why this is an equity issue, because all over the country, kids aren't being taught how to read. Some kids have a backup plan, which is their parents' checkbook, but a lot of kids don't have that backup plan.
Yes, one of the interviewees in Sold a Story refers to learning to read as a rich man's game in the US now, and I thought that was that was a sort of a devastating indictment of the situation. Now, I'd like to start to take some questions from our audience, and I'll go to Tricia, and I'll adapt her question a little bit here. She observes that the debate, particularly around phonics and decoding, has ultimately looked and felt a little bit like a partisan political issue at times in the US and across the English-speaking world. It's true here in Australia as well. Why has that been an ideological battleground, and why has that become a controversial issue around understanding really a scientific evidence base and otherwise?
Well, I think there are many reasons for that. And I've also been learning that it's not just in the English-speaking world. I think there are similar partisan political dynamics about whether you teach kids how to read the words and teach decoding in Spanish-speaking countries, for example. And French has a lot of the same problems, partly because French, like English, is a difficult language to decode, but Spanish is actually a very easy language to decode. And in the Spanish-speaking countries, they have some of these same dynamics. So what is the reason for that? Well, phonics per se has been around for a long time, right? And it has been associated with a kind of back to basics, traditional, conservative approach. And it has been for centuries. And I think there were these basic partisan political divides around how you teach kids to read were actually like set hundreds of years ago in the United States. And they kind of have had a very hard time breaking away from that. And there have been some key moments in recent United States history that have sort of reified that idea. The whole language movement or balanced literacy movement in the United States was sort of, which employed some of these cueing techniques, like there's lots of ways to know what the written word is, and we should focus more on the meaning rather than the little skills that it takes to get kids to meaning, which I think was just mostly a misunderstanding of reading and how it works. But a lot of that movement was associated with a sort of more liberal, left, progressive kind of way of doing things in schools and in the world. And then more recently, we had a very big push, a multi-billion-dollar push in the United States to try to bring schools along with the science of reading. And it was led by a Republican conservative, George Bush. So that got associated in a lot of people's minds. So it's just, and that was actually one of the reasons why I got so interested in this topic, because the politics are fascinating, confounding, and very much misunderstood in that it has that reputation for being sort of a right-left kind of thing. And there are actual things in history that give you evidence that that has been the case. But if you talk to a lot of the scientific research who's discovered a lot of this, you'll discover that they are not right-wing conservatives. Many of them have said, say themselves, I'm one of the most lefty people, liberal people you can imagine. And I know from the research that teaching kids these basic skills is absolutely essential. Talk to many of the parents who have figured out that their kids are struggling with reading. They're coming from all over the political spectrum and making the same argument about the need for really getting these basic skills right at the beginning of education.
So you've highlighted a few different terms here and there: whole language, phonics, balanced literacy. Probably for some people that follow these discussions, they may be familiar with the idea of phonics, the idea of whole language. If they hear balanced literacy, whether as educators or as parents or just general observers, one might think that that's something that's overcome that binary debate. Why is it that balanced literacy has not really resolved, or is not really an improvement on that previous deficits?
Again, it's about going back to the idea, right? So this is what Sold a Story was really about. I started to realize there's this idea upon which the reading instruction is founded. And it's this idea that we've thought about for a long time, which is essentially, do kids need to learn how to sound out the words, or can we start with meaning first? So it's been sort of like seen as meaning first or phonics first, a sort of bottom-up approach to teaching versus a top-down. But balanced literacy, there's no precise definition of this term. People will say it's different things. It includes many things. Many of the things that are included as part of balanced literacy are very good things, are things that research show we should be doing, making sure kids have lots of access to books, making sure kids have time to read, all these kinds of things. But really what happened is balanced literacy sort of morphed out of whole language. And what happened is some phonics got added. There was sort of an acceptance like, oh yeah, we've got to teach some kids some phonics. That's very true. But this other idea remained, which is, well, we'll teach them some phonics, but it's not that important because they don't have to know that. because there are other ways to know what the words are. You don't have to know how to sound them out. You can also teach them all these other strategies. So balanced literacy was like, well, let's add some phonics, but let's keep doing the things we've been doing. And it sounds really good because we all want balance in our lives. I wish there was more balance in the world. We all desperately need it. But the problem is that balanced literacy is really just sort of an iteration of whole language. It is different from whole language in many ways, and it does include phonics. And people are right to say, you know, I teach some phonics in my balanced literacy classroom. Those teachers will also tell you that they also send their kids off to their guided reading groups with their leveled readers at the early stages with all kinds of words that kids have not been taught how to read. They could not sound these out, most of them. So the only thing they can do is guess and use the pictures. They learn that as a strategy. They learn that as a habit. Many kids keep with those habits because this whole learning to read thing is actually pretty hard. So if you give kids an easy way to do it at the beginning, that's a problem because many kids will just do it the easy way, especially if the harder way is especially hard for them, right? But other kids start to learn the harder way, sounding them out, and realize, oh, that's actually more efficient and effective. Once I get this thing down, that's actually going to be much more accurate and I'm going to be much more successful. But kids who don't see that, who don't start to get that early, I think cling to these approaches. And I hear this from reading tutors and parents and teachers of middle school and high school kids and college kids all over the world. So anyway, I think balanced literacy sounds really good. But what I've tried to show in my reporting is that there's a core idea at the base of it. And this idea is not correct.
Is there a sense that kids now read a lot more in a digital format than in the past, including and adults as well, for that matter? Is there a sense that we're conflating some of what we're identifying as instructional casualties with actually just changing technologies and changing methods and formats of reading? Could we be is it just a digital age question rather than a reading instruction question?
Well, I think there's a lot to say about that. It's not a digital age problem because we know that we had these problems long before the digital age, right? So our reading scores here in the United States haven't changed that much from before anyone had a Kindle or Twitter or an iPhone or a computer, right? And so they just haven't gotten much better. That is not to say that the digital age is not affecting reading and reading development, all of us. I know it's affected me and sort of my absorption with reading, the amount of time I'll spend on task. I am definitely on the screen, tend to be much more of a skimmer, don't get to the end of articles all the time. When I sit down with the newspaper, when I sit with a book in my bed at the end of the day, I'm much more able to get engaged. I'm much more able to read for a long time. So these are really real things that we need to contend with. And if your audience hasn't read Marianne Wolf's books, I highly recommend them, especially Reader Come Home, because she's talking all about this question. But this is not a problem caused by the digital age because we had it before the digital age began.
We'll start to get through to some of the implications, impacts, and aftermath, ultimately, of your reporting, including Sold a Story. Rebecca asks, more and more families, teachers and schools get the importance of evidence-based reading instruction. Are politicians, unions and university faculties starting to appreciate it also?
I think so. I'll have to answer for the United States because I can't answer for Australia on that one. Certainly, politicians, legislators, policymakers here are very interested in this. And I think that's both a positive thing and sort of a dangerous thing. You know, policy is like a blunt force instrument, always has unintended consequences. So there are many laws that are being passed in the United States to try to do a variety of things. Have schools make sure they use screeners, good screeners, to identify the kids who are struggling. Legislation to make sure that teachers are getting good training. You know, then the question is, what training are they getting? Is it really good? There are changes in curriculum. There's all kinds of things that are being tried in the United States. So I think legislators and policymakers are getting very involved in this. Whenever I get a chance to talk to legislators and policymakers, I acknowledge that they have a very hard job and many things to do, but I really hope that they'll pick up a few good books about this, that they'll engage in it and just give themselves a pretty basic knowledge about reading and how it works in the brain, because I really think that legislation needs to include an understanding of some of the nuances of all of this. Otherwise, we can go astray. For example, just telling schools they have to add phonics isn't going to solve the problem, because that's a little bit what happened in balanced literacy. They added phonics, but didn't take away this other stuff. So you got to look at the whole picture. And anytime you make, this is also so complex for so many reasons that making one change isn't going to be enough. So if you go in and you just change the curriculum, but you don't do anything to change the teacher training, for example, I don't think you're going to get a good result. Otherwise, if you just change the teacher training and don't look at the curriculum and the assessments, you're not going to get a good change, which makes it hard to study this. The best studies we do, change one thing, look to see if there was an impact. But the impact is probably going to be small, because changing one thing isn't going to be enough. You got to change multiple things here.
I'm borrowing a little bit from Ian's question here as well, but why has it been so hard for particularly university-based teacher trainers? Why has it been so hard for them to really follow and be a driver of changing practice available to teachers?
I mean, I think the hard truth to that is that many people within schools of education were invested in the whole language movement years ago. And that movement really was a movement that was sort of took off within schools of education. And they have just been sort of distant from, in many ways, the research that was going on like across the quad. In a different department, what the cognitive scientists were doing, what the learning scientists were doing. And so I think it's just actually extremely difficult. I think that sometimes the people in schools of education are in some of sort of the most difficult position with all of this, because they have been promoting some of these things that are now really being looked at in a different way. And many of those people have kind of skin in the game, as in they've written books or research or done things that are sort of being questioned now. Whereas I think teachers within schools, many of them don't have any skin in this game, as in they just want kids to learn how to read. They're doing what they've learned from their colleagues, what they've learned from their professional development. If someone comes along and offers them other knowledge, other materials to use, many of them are like, of course, and I will use this. Is this going to work better? And then they often use it and it does work better. I actually think it's easier writ large, many exceptions to this rule. There are teachers who are very resistant and don't want to change what they are doing. And there are many people within schools of education who know the science, understand it, are promoting it, are pushing on it from within. So it's a very mixed picture out there. So what I just said are big, broad generalizations, but I do think this topic is very difficult for many faculty within schools of education.
So you've highlighted really there that within schools, there's this movement of educators who are really hungry for better evidence about how to be effective. And we work within communities like that here in Australia, just as I'm sure you do in the US. And to take Roger's question here, he asks, do you have insights into advocacy approaches that are successful in persuading legislators and educational leaders to adopt phonics and decoding for reading instruction?
You know, I am a journalist, not an advocate. So I do what I do. I do research, I write, I tell stories, and then it goes out into the world and people do things with it. I will say that I am a big believer as a journalist, as what I do. I'm a big believer that knowledge is powerful and knowledge can really change people's minds. And I'm also a big believer that stories and narrative and understanding other people's experiences can really change people's minds. So I try to do those two things together to sort of explain. I've sort of tried to, I feel like I'm sort of an explanatory journalist, really. I've just tried to explain some of the basics of the science. So I guess I think that the ultimate answer is helping whoever you're trying to convince, helping them understand it, showing them all the evidence, pointing them to books, articles. Right now, there is just a huge amount of good stuff out there being written for a general audience, blog posts and articles and books and podcasts, and not just mine, other people's. There's digestible stuff. And so I think it really is about putting this stuff in front of people and engaging with them by helping them understand the stakes because the stakes here are really high. And there are many people with a story to tell. And that story has a lesson in it. And the lesson is we need to know better and do better here, because lots of kids and families and teachers are suffering, are being harmed by us not doing better.
Rebecca asks, has there been backlash in some quarters to Sold a Story and, of course, to the ongoing reporting that you've done over the years?
Of course. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I have certainly, I have learned the complexity and the partisan nature and the politics of all this. This is very tricky waters. It is full of landmines. The only thing I can do is just keep trying to speak from a position of subject matter expertise. If I turned my computer around, you could see my bookcase. And I've just read a lot about this, tried to inform myself, talked to lots of people. There's more for me to learn. There's more for everyone to learn. But yeah, of course, there's pushback. And of course, there's reaction. But my inbox is filled with notes from parents and teachers and children who are saying, like, thank you. Like either I didn't know this, or I did know this, but no one else did. And now they do. And more people need to know this though. So thanks. So I get hate in my inbox, but on balance, I get more people saying, I'm glad I know this now, or thank you for putting that out into the world. I appreciate it.
It doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence that some of this movement has really developed over the last few years when parents have been a bit more engaged and a bit more seeing close to hand the impact of reading instruction and particularly reading difficulties. Do you think that this momentum would exist if it weren't for COVID-19 and home-based learning during that period?
That's a really interesting question. There was certainly a lot of awareness before. So I do not want to diminish the fact that there are a lot of, there's a strong advocacy movement of parents in the United States. But I think one of the things that COVID did is that it helped parents of kids who maybe are struggling a little, but not the parents of kids with dyslexia per se, not the parents of kids with reading disabilities. So, because that is a very strong movement for a reason in the United States, right? Because those kids are like the canaries in the coal mine who are being harmed the most. But as you said, I think COVID just allowed a whole bunch of parents to get a little peek into the classroom. When we drop our kids off at school, even when they're, little kids, we drop them off and we trust that they are getting what they need, including being taught to read. I think we all take our kids to school and assume they're going to be taught how to read. And we don't know a lot of what goes on. Maybe we get to, as our kids get older, we know less and less, it becomes more and more of a black box. You can kind of go in and visit and do volunteer day when they're little, but you're not necessarily there while the reading instruction is going on. But now over COVID, parents were there as the reading instruction was going on. And they were kind of going, wait, what? Why are they doing that? Why are they teaching the kid that way? Oh, she's kind of struggling here. She's frustrated. I'm seeing how my kid is reacting. And it just made them ask questions. And I think this is incredibly powerful because I think what's happening now, and one of the reasons I wanted to make Sold a Story, one of the things I said to my editor is I feel like this is going to be successful if I start getting emails from the moms of kids who aren't struggling with reading and who are saying, oh, this matters to me too. I want to do something about this. What can I do? How can I change? My kid's fine. How can I change reading instruction in my school? Because I see why this is a problem for other kids. Or as some of the kids who are in Sold a Story, those are kids who I don't think have learning disabilities, but they were struggling with reading and might have been those kids who kind of limped along a little bit and maybe never got really good at it, except the parents saw the way they were being taught to read and they swooped in and were like, I'm going to teach them myself. And they did it successfully. And now those parents are really worked up about this and want to make sure that all kids it shouldn't take a parent, seeing the instruction online and being like, I've got to solve this problem. This is not a problem that parents should be solving. Schools should be teaching kids how to read. I actually think that we may not necessarily all agree on that in this country or in this world, because some of the pushback I get is, well, it's the parents' fault. And I still get that, even after, and I'm like, have you listened? Have you read? But some of them say they have, and they still say, but the parents should teach them. And so I guess that's a question. Do we think that it's the school's job to teach kids how to read? I think it is the school's job to teach kids how to read. And I think it has to be, because we cannot even fathom a more equitable society unless we decide that that is absolutely the first and fundamental role of public education, is to teach kids how to read.
You, during Sold a Story, you get to the point of specifically identifying a specific publishing company and the work of 4 key players in reading instruction that you think are the main contributors to the kinds of problems that we've been talking about. Just without summarising 6 podcasts and years of research into a few minutes, what is it that leads you to conclude that these are the key contributors to that challenge?
Well, I think because I kept being told about them along the way. So I was just hearing certain names and certain programs. And I point out in episode 1 of Sold a Story that they're not the only ones who have been selling this queuing idea, but they've become very successful at it. And I would say it becomes sort of the brand name version of balanced literacy, at least here in the United States. And they do all share one common publisher. Their publisher publishes a lot of different things. It doesn't only publish this balanced literacy material and these 4 authors that I'm talking about, but I started to make those connections. These names of particular people and particular programs were being mentioned to me a lot. I started to try to figure out who they were. I noticed that they were all published by the same company. And I just thought, what's the story here? And that's really where Sold a Story kind of began. Like, let's figure out what's the story. Who are these people? It turns out how are they connected to each other? How did they influence each other? And again, Sold a Story includes all these people. You wouldn't want to listen to a podcast unless you were hearing the stories of people, but Sold a Story is fundamentally the story of an idea. And that was why it was really hard to do. It was sort of about how a wrong idea about reading took hold. And I think these people in this company were a part of that story. But here in the United States, anyway, the curriculum market is very varied. And everyone's supposed to be able to do their own thing. We really believe in local control here in the United States. But the interesting thing is, it's supposed to be sort of 1,000 flowers blooming. But when you actually look at how they're teaching reading, many schools are teaching it the same way. They're using some of the same materials, the same ideas, the same kinds of books, the same kinds of assessments. So that was where I was like, oh, that's interesting. So that's how I got there.
So for those in our audience who may be educators or parents, I'd like to perhaps share with them some insights about what things can help kids to become better readers. One of the key observations that you make is that so-called leveled books are not necessarily the best tool for all kids, but instead decodable books are more suitable. For those who have not come across these before, what is it that you mean by that in those types of reading material?
Well, I think this question of what children are given to read in school when they're learning, when they're being taught how to read, is really important. So you're teaching kids something about how to read, and then you're giving them a book to practice that. So what are they practicing? Are they practicing what you taught them? So decodable books is basically just a word for a book where the words are decodable, as in they're connected to some sequence of learning that the kids have done. They've been taught something about the spelling patterns of certain kinds of words, and they read a book that has a lot of those kinds of words in it so they can practice that. And it doesn't have a lot of words with spelling patterns they don't know, so they don't have to guess the word and get into that habit of thinking reading is about guessing the words, not about sounding them out. So a decodable book basically helps them develop the habit of what reading is. These leveled books tend to start at the very early stages, more focused on the meaning, like a good story that has lots of different words in it that maybe are long words that kids haven't learned how to sound out, and they have to guess the words. And it actually teaches them a different definition of reading. And that's actually where Sold a Story kind of fundamentally lands, which is this big kind of like, cue the strange music. What is reading? What is it? Is it actually reading the words on the page that the author wrote? Or is it kind of getting the gist of it, guessing, coming up with an approximation of what might be on the page? And I think maybe without really knowing it, the way the kids have been taught kindergarten, first grade is actually leading them towards this kind of gisty, make what you want of it way of reading, rather than really closely read a text and try to understand what the author is saying. And really closely reading a text and figuring out what the author is saying is actually what we tell kids reading is when they get to middle school and high school, but they haven't necessarily been taught the skills to actually do it. They're actually reading this other way.
Another slightly technical one related to the work that parents might see at home. Many parents will be familiar with cards of sight words, what we call sight words or parents might know as sight words. What is it about sight words that are not always the most successful for kids that are still learning to read?
It is promoting that idea that you just look at a word and memorize it, like you take a picture of it and you try to memorize it. And like I said, you can do that with a certain number of words. There are experiments that show it, that people can memorize a certain number, but it's not a good way to become a good reader. That starts to fall apart. So memorizing lots of words is not the way that you make those links between those three things: pronunciation, spelling, and meaning, and get those words really into your mind. And so that's the kind of thing that can make a kid look like a good reader when they're not, because they've memorized some words. They suddenly don't have the mental capacity to memorize many more, and they actually can't read the words. They don't have the tools to figure out the words on their own.
Julie in our audience asks, what are the best ways of assessing reading within schools that you've come across?
Well, there are a lot of different kinds of assessments that people use, and they drill down into the actual subsets of skills that lead to good reading, instead of these kinds of broad assessments that are often given that find a kid's reading level, which is about giving them a book and sort of figuring out what book can they read with 90 to 95% accuracy and answer some comprehension questions. And then, oh, he's a level D. Okay, now it's time for him to try a level, ebook. That turns out to not be very accurate. There's lots of research that shows that it's not reliable, not accurate. And it doesn't tell you much about, like, you can say, oh, well, a kid can read a level D book, but why can he read that? Or he can't read a level D book, but why can he read that one? And it can be very random because it can depend very much on the particular level D book that you give him. If he's a kid, I use this example in Sold a Story, who loves baseball, for example, he might actually know a lot of the words associated with baseball and have some of those words memorized and be able to read that book no problem, and has the background knowledge to bring to it. You could give that same book, you could give that kid some other book about a totally different topic and they don't know the words and they'll totally fall apart. So these a kid's reading level with these leveled readers is not a particularly good indication of how well they read. And you really want an assessment that's going to tell you, oh, this kid has a phonemic awareness problem, or this kid is having a problem with these kinds of word patterns. There's a hole in their teaching, something that they need to be taught.
We're approaching the end here, Emily, but I wanted to get an understanding from you about what comes next after Sold a Story in your work.
That is an excellent question that I am asking myself right now. And I don't know. I would say that most of my work is really focused on early reading instruction. I continue to be very interested in what happens to kids when they're older, and what schools are doing about that. I mean, this is a real profound question in many schools right now and in my email inbox. As people are trying to better tackle early instruction, it's a harder problem to solve about what you do with all the kids who are already in 6th or 7th grade or in 12th grade. So I'd love to do some more reporting about that, plus a lot of other things. So I hope I'll still be on. I think there's more questions to answer with this topic. So I hope to stay on it writ large. Stay tuned.
Jeanette asks us in our last few minutes here, is there a change in practice that you're observing in systems quite broadly? And she also comments, we've also found there are clear links with issues in writing as well as with reading. And can you comment on what you've experienced in terms of that link between the reading issues but also writing issues that seem to be overlapping?
Absolutely. I mean, they overlap. And if you look at cognitive science, you can see why Spelling, really important. It's the other, sort of mirror image of reading, right? There's the decoding, there's the encoding. That is a big problem for a lot of kids. I think writing isn't taught enough of it as a skill. It is a skill. I know as a professional writer that becoming a good writer is not just about practicing it. There are real skills you need to have that add up to good writing. And I think there's a lot of change going on right now in the United States. It's hard to get a handle on it. Again, we have thousands of school districts in this country. It's a gigantic, diffuse system. That is a big problem. It was a big challenge in our reporting, is just trying to figure out what schools are doing. Like really just getting and accounting all of this is very hard. So getting an accounting of the change is even more difficult because it's now like in flux. I think a lot of parents have experienced like just going to their school system's website and being like, how does my kid's school teach reading? And you can't necessarily find an answer. But I think there's a lot of change going on. I hope a lot of it's good change. I hope there will be a continued movement towards being interested in more knowledge so that the changes that are made well in an informed way, from the legislative level to, the teacher in her own first grade classroom who's making changes on her own, and everything in between.
So finally then, to wrap us up, Emily, are you an optimist or a pessimist about where reading goes in the US and the English-speaking world?
I am an optimistic person who is prone to depression. So that's my personality. And I don't know, I'm optimistic about it. I guess I would rather turn to other people who have told me they're optimistic, cautiously optimistic. But I think there's an accumulation of things that maybe have gotten us to a tipping point. Even 20 years ago, when there was a big effort to do this in the United States, I think maybe there just wasn't robust enough stuff happening in different places. But now the research is so clear and so deep. There's a very strong parent advocacy movement. Teachers are starting to understand this problem. Parents of kids who aren't struggling to read, legislators are on it. It's not just a big federal government effort. It's happening in states all over the country. School board members are writing the emails. So I think there's just awareness now bubbling up and among many different places. So I guess I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful that has to mean good change in the world. I hope.
Emily Hanford, thanks so much for joining us here at CIS.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And a special thanks to all of those who joined us today online, including those who are just preparing to start the new school year. To keep up to date with CIS events, please look to our website, cis.org.au, and stay tuned on our upcoming events. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.